Hello, I'm Dana Sparks, Managing Broker of Maximum One Realty Greater Atlanta. And today's contract tip has to do with the due diligence period and extending the due diligence period. We have had a couple of contracts come across with the buyer submitting a unilateral notice to extend the inspection period. It is a GAR form, Georgia Association of Realtors form. It is form number F134. Notice to unilaterally extend the inspection period. The problem, however, is that most of these contracts are binding subject to a due diligence period, not subject to an inspection period. Here's the difference. Under the GAR contract, purchase and sale agreement, F20, it allows for a due diligence period for the buyer if the buyer and the seller agree to it, and that is a time frame from the binding agreement date within which the buyer decides if they're going to proceed with the purchase or not. Specifically stated, I will tell you what it says. It says the property is sold as is unless the agreement is subject to a due diligence period. In general, the due diligence period basically creates an option contract for the buyer to choose whether or not to proceed with the sale or not. In paragraph B9D2, did you get that? Purpose of the due diligence period. During the due diligence period, the buyer shall determine whether or not to exercise the buyer's option to proceed or not to proceed with the purchase of the property. If the buyer has any concerns with the property, the buyer may, during this due diligence period, seek to negotiate an amendment to this agreement to address such concerns. So that's all the due diligence period accounts for, is an option contract for the buyer. If the buyer has any concerns with the property, then there is an amendment called the amendment to address concerns with the property, by which the buyer may submit it to the seller if there are any concerns to negotiate through, and at that point either choose to proceed with the transaction or terminate prior to the end of the due diligence period. That time frame, that option time frame, may not be unilaterally extended. It is determined between the buyer and the seller when those parties are negotiating the contract. So this form, the notice to unilaterally extend the inspection period that some buyer's agents are using, is totally inappropriate and does not apply to these contracts unless you make that contract subject to an inspection period and a resolution defect period. So with just a regular purchase and sale transaction without any special exhibits, that amendment does not apply. The parties, the buyer and the seller, may choose to add an exhibit called the property sold with right to request repairs. That is an exhibit in the GAR forms. And it specifically states that the buyer shall have the right to request that the seller repair and or replace defects, if any, in the property as identified by the buyer's inspector in a written report, blank number of days from binding agreement date. So what this exhibit allows for, and it is a GAR form, exhibit F129, property sold with right to request repairs exhibit. It specifically delineates the procedures by which a buyer specifically has an inspector. The inspector writes a report. The buyer submits the inspection report along with an amendment for the seller to repair or replace any specific items that must be included in the inspector's report. And that time frame within which to negotiate through any of those items is called the defect resolution period. Now, even within that, well, first of all, a contract must be subject to the property sold with those rights in order for a buyer to use the notice to unilaterally extend the inspection period. But even within that, a buyer may not just use that because they did not have time to have their inspections done. The only way a buyer may unilaterally extend an inspection period is, number one, if the parties made the transaction subject to the right to request repairs, and number two, within that within that contingency, only if the inspector in the written report, as written by the inspector and submitted to the seller, recommends any additional test, study, inspection, or evaluation of any product, item, or condition with the property. That is the only way a buyer may unilaterally extend that inspection period, and within that is only up to 7 days. So, long story short, the majority of contracts that we see are subject to a due diligence period, which is a mini option contract within the broad context of the purchase and sale agreement. There are no unilateral rights to extend it. The only way a buyer and a seller may extend that due diligence period is by amendment, hence agreement between the buyer and the seller. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I am Dana Sparks, Managing Broker of Maximum One Realty Greater Atlanta, satisfying your needs with service, education, and innovation.